I get it. Good morning. Apparently I did. If you want to look at that little picture I sent this morning, I think it got shared around. But if you want to pull that out, if you've not looked at it, if you wouldn't mind, one of the sisters that I share the image with from different areas, I'm like her. These are sometimes very fascinating. Those things where however you look at it depends on what pops out to you and what you see. But if you'd like to look at that, appreciate everybody being here. Rhonda Ray's sister got to come and visit. She could be anywhere she wanted this morning, but she chose to come to church with us. And I know that means the world to Rhonda Ray, so we hope everybody feels welcomed. When you look at that picture, what did somebody share what they see? Me too. Did anybody see something different? And it kind of does, doesn't it? Yeah. Like a candle holder thing, or maybe somebody saw like a vase pedestal. Reminds me of one of those like things you put something on top of that's flat at the top. But when you look at it, some of you might see that, a platter, pedestal, into your dining room table, vase, whatever it is. Two people's faces seeing each other. That's probably the part that stands out to me the most prominent in contrast. But all those images are correct answers. There was no incorrect in those regards. Now, if someone looked at it and said, I see a giraffe, we might need some explanation. I'm not quite sure we look at that and see a zoo animal, but it just depends on what jumps out at you first when you look at the image. And, if someone looks at that image, let's say, without her glasses. Let's say it's a person who wears glasses and they look at that image and they don't have their glasses on. Then certain aspects of that image might be more prominent, mightn't they? Because of your vision and your ability to see without glasses. If you're half asleep, let's say someone just hears their phone beep and they roll over and they open it up and they're not even fully awake. Certain aspects of the image will jump out at them differently than if somebody was fully awake, wouldn't it? They might not get a full perception of what it looks like. I mean, who knows? And it doesn't matter. I mean, it's just a fun little image. But whatever jumped out at you is what you saw. But there are specific situations that could actually impact what we see. If someone wears glasses and they don't have them on at the time, if somebody's not fully awake, our vision can be skewed when we're not fully able to see or when we're not fully aware, correct? If you're looking at something, your ability to view it clearly can be skewed. And I have kind of just a funny example. The other day I was driving, and all of a sudden Rhonda Ray yelled out at me, "Deer!" But there were no deer. There were none. I saw a large section of a tree that had kind of been on the side of the road, and I thought, well, maybe she saw that. Well, she had propped her feet up on the dash, letting them warm because they were kind of cold. Well, she was partly asleep. And I don't know if I took a curve or what, but she just happened to kind of open her eyes. And apparently when she saw her feet, she wasn't fully awake. She yelled, "Deer!" She wasn't full, and we have laughed about that. She was like, "Oh my word, I think that was my feet." And so so we had a good little laugh. But at that moment of time in her life, she could have mistaken glimpsing her feet on my dash as a potential deer in the road because she wasn't fully aware. And we laughed about it. Her perception was off. And you know what? Maybe your perception at the moment you looked at that image I sent, if you chose to look at it before service, that whatever your perception was at that moment had an impact on what you saw, didn't it? Because we're all different people. Whether you see the middle section or you focus on the two sides. But I use that, just kind of a silly example, and thinking about, am I fully aware? Is my vision what it needs to be? But for me, I was just, as I prepared for this, self-reflecting, I want to be fully aware of how the Lord perceives me. I want to be fully aware of how he perceives my efforts to serve him. I can have a perception, but does it match the reality of what he sees? In Psalm 139, in verses 23 and 24, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. I have a way that I can feel God or others perceive me. That's just human nature. And I talked about this some, I guess it was last week, about perception. But thinking about, we all have a way that we hope to be perceived. We all have a way that we hope that people will view us. And it's kind of comical. Sometimes as individuals or just human beings in general, we can even defend how we should be perceived. I can be defensive of that, can't I? If I find out somebody's not perceiving me, or my ways are not perceived the way I thought they ought to be, if I find out maybe something is questioned about my service, whatever it is, if it's not viewed the way I think it ought to be viewed, if not careful, I could start to be defensive of my perception. But what if God's trying to show me something? I'm going to use a personal example later of how the Lord helped me with something. It's kind of funny when you think about that. If you imagine, I'll just use this as a silly example. If somebody's a self-proclaimed comedian, but he has to explain to everyone around him why he's funny, is he a very effective comedian? No. He may have a self-perception that he's a comedian. He may view himself that he should be viewed as a comedian, but no one around him thinks he is. And he has to explain it. And that's sad, isn't it? Now, that's just a silly example. But imagine if the devil could get me in that situation. I perceive myself as such and such. I perceive myself as whatever it is, and I proclaim it. But that is not the perception that God has of me, or maybe others. There are people, and we can take this in so many ways. And so you think about it as an individual. When you hear something, I want to think about it as, first of all, if the Lord can show me something, he'll help me. But also to think about people sometimes you care about, or where you see areas of concern. People can look at their own lives, and if not careful, they self-justify everything they're doing, don't they? Then they're mad when you don't perceive their self-justification as okay. They're upset because their perception doesn't match the reality that you see in their life. They have themselves convinced that, let's just say as an example, and I'm sure we've all met situations like this because we're all old enough to have done so. Most of us anyway, with some understanding. Most of us are there. They have themselves convinced that the way they're living is fine. They can convince themselves that everything they do is acceptable in God's eyes. However, are they living a reality that he sees? Is their perception matching God's perception? Because it's easy to convince yourself of anything you want to be convinced of, isn't it? The mind is a very powerful thing. And I can convince myself of anything if I want to be. However, an individual living in such a way is not willing to be fully aware of how God sees them. And that's the most important thing. God knows everything about my heart and life. So my goal for when I think about these things, Lord, help me to really see myself as he sees me. Let my perception match the reality of how he judges my life. I could self-justify lots of things, but if in God's eyes it's not okay, is it doing me any good to self-justify? No. And people can take it to extremes. There are people who can lead extreme and ostracize themselves from every and anything in a name of saying they're more holy and righteous. And all they're doing is making themselves and everyone around them miserable. It can go in either extreme. Some who live so loosely, everything and anything's okay. Everybody's justified, because if you feel that that's justifiable, that's not okay either. He'll put it in a plain path that's straight. In Psalm 147 and verse 5, great is our Lord and of great power. His understanding is, and this is what I appreciate, infinite. I may want to have an understanding of myself, but what I should care most about is what's God's knowledge of who I really am. And I pray he show me. And he will if I'm honest. I had him show me something the other evening about myself that I needed to reflect on. In Jeremiah 1 and 5, before I formed thee in the belly, and this verse goes on, but I only took part of it. Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. Before I was even formed, he already had a perception of me. As I grow, hopefully, and as I continue to, hopefully, live, I will also continue to have perceptions of my life, won't I? But the question I need to ask myself is how I perceiving myself matching up with how God perceives the reality of who I am as a professed believer of him? Does it match? Do I match what he expects? Am I living with the attitude he expects me to have? Am I living with the expectation that he takes priority and that my understanding comes from him? He show me how he perceives me. In Matthew 10:30, but the very hairs of your head are all numbered. He knows us infinitely well, intimately and infinitely. So I can't hide anything to God. Sometimes you can hide things from people, and it's okay. Sometimes people have private struggles in that regard, and you don't tell everything. I heard a minister, very respected minister, speaking one time. It isn't wisdom to tell everything. That can cause more hurt. That can cause harm and confusion with people who don't understand. I'm very cautious with some things that I personally share that tend to be very personal, because I've learned from life experience, I better be cautious, because I don't want to cause someone else hurt because I alter their perception of what's right or wrong or whatever just because of something that I may feel personally. Nothing, though, is secret to God. If something about my life is not where it needs to be, whether it be attitude, a spirit about me, a belief, or whatever, you can take it however you want it, then no matter how much I try to convince myself that everything about me is okay, and we know this intellectually, but when you really think about it, I'm just making myself look ridiculous. The comedian who has to explain he's funny is embarrassing himself. I'm embarrassing myself before the Lord. Nothing is hidden from him. Whether or not I want to own a concern that I should have about my life or my spiritual walk with God is irrelevant to the fact that he already knows it. Whether I want to admit it or not is irrelevant to the notion and understanding that he already knows that. Whether I want to perceive the problem, let's just say, or perceive the concern, it really doesn't matter in the sense I can't hide it from God, can I? He already has a perception of my reality. But I think about that, and we all know that intellectually, most likely. Those of us here old enough to understand and with the background, I'd say most. But what does the devil want to do? He wants to confuse. The devil is the captain of confusion. The devil wants me to believe a lie and potentially be damned before God. The devil may not mind too much, even if someone goes to church, or if they proclaim to believe in Jesus, as long as that person allows him, the devil, to skew the true vision of where they stand with God. If he can skew that, he really may not mind what all they profess and say, because in the process of their profession and their proclamation, it might cause trouble for other people. He can use them as a tool to spread confusion, and that's terrible. And the devil wants me to be confused, because that confusion leads to darkness if I'm not careful. In 1 Corinthians 14:33, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints. And I appreciate that. When things are not unclear, I have learned those are not the best times to make big decisions. When you live with a little bit of air of uncertainty, that is not wrong. That is not sin. Not understanding, there is no shame in that, as long as I'm willing to ask the Lord to show me how I truly should perceive it. And I will adhere to what he shows me. For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints. In 2 Timothy 2:7, consider what I say, and the Lord give thee, and I appreciate this, understanding in all things. People out of probably honest intent and honest heart will also feel they have understanding, and they perceive themselves as this is how it's got to be. And I just have learned in life to be very cautious with approach to people, as I'm sure any of us here who've lived any life have had to learn. Because I use that example again. What happens when you force feed a baby? It makes a mess. And sometimes with people, it may not be easy to understand. Why aren't people's understanding here? Or why aren't people's understandings there? But what I've learned is, given time, from personal experience, the Lord can show me what I need to know and what I need to perceive, and I appreciate his patience. But as human beings, is it always easy to have patience? No. Sometimes it's easier to just want to be, listen, I've taught math content for now almost a quarter of a century. I haven't done it every year of all that time, but for a long part of my career, I've taught math. Guess the number one thing I have to remind myself of sometimes? they've not done it for almost a quarter of a century. Because it's easy when you have understanding of a topic, let's say in math, I'm just using that, and you have understanding of that, why can't they just get it? Well, I wish they could get it first time every time too. And sometimes you wonder, oh Lord, what am I doing wrong? But I have to remember, it's not something they've had over and over and over like me. And I have to be understanding of that. And I appreciate God with his understanding that, like for me the other night, I can talk from a personal experience, which I'm going to share some of, not details, that he just understood. I needed some time to understand how I was feeling at the moment. And then he brought me enlightenment. And I appreciate that God will do that. He will help your perception line up if you're being honest. But it's just like that poor comedian. Well, people have a problem with this. I'm funny. Well, honey, you keep telling yourself that. But all you do is further embarrass yourself when you keep acting on only your self-perception. If I act only on that, and you can take it to whatever extreme, people who have convinced themselves their lives are okay no matter what they do. That's a self-perception that could lead them where? To hell. I mean, it's just the truth. And who wants to end up there? Most people don't wake up in the morning, well, I hope I split hell wide open. I don't think anybody wakes up thinking that. If they do, they've really got a problem, don't they? There's a real spirit working there that's confusing and harsh. But the devil loves to work in confusion and spread it. And the easiest way, get somebody's self-perception off track. Let them perceive themselves in the way they wish and not the way God sees them. And then he has room to work, doesn't he? But God will give understanding if I'm honest-hearted. In 1 John 4:1, beloved, believe not every what? Spirit. But try the spirits, whether they are of God. And then I'll use this verse a little later, but I don't read the next part. Because many false prophets are gone out into the world. And of course, there's a caution to be careful with what and whom we listen to. I understand that. But also to try the spirit. What if something's trying to work on me? Does that mean I should embrace it? I may have a perception that what's trying to work on me is validated and okay. I can feel this way, but I better try the spirit. It might be the devil trying to work in a bad attitude on me. When Rhonda Ray called out the word deer, she truly thought she was seeing them, didn't she? She was kind of partly asleep, and she may have seen her feet. But at the time, she was mistaken. But do you think it bothered her to say, oh, I was wrong? Well, of course not. It was no big deal. Her perception was off. But there are times when the devil doesn't want me to admit what? That I'm wrong. He doesn't like for me to admit that. He doesn't like for me to admit, or he doesn't want me to embrace that I should admit, that my attitude is off kilter. I may perceive myself as having every right to feel the way I do about something. But what if God isn't pleased with my attitude in it? Then my perception is off, isn't it? No matter how I want to perceive myself, I need an attitude adjustment. And I'm speaking from personal experience recently. I found this out the other day. I was battling, and I shared it with Rhonda Ray, of course, because she's there to help me. She loves me. But I was battling. And let me just add as a side note, when you have a companion who loves you, she listened. She didn't judge me. She wasn't hateful. She didn't tell me how wrong I was or try to belittle what I was feeling. So that is valuable, and I want to thank the Lord I have a companion who will offer me that. She listened. But I found this out the other day. I was battling. I felt so angry about something. I could even recognize in my mind that it was kind of dumb to feel that way. I was like, Rhonda, this is so stupid. Why do I feel this way about this? And I shared with her what I was battling. I was open to share that it made no sense that I felt that way. But what I was battling was actually very real to me. Whether someone else could perceive it as real or not, as necessary or not, was irrelevant because they weren't battling it. I was, and it was real to me. Now, what if I'd given over to the temptation to embrace the anger? What would have happened? Honey, I don't know that she could have stood me. I'd have got madder and what? Madder and madder and madder. What if I'd allowed myself the perception, well, what you're feeling, Danny's just fine. Be mad, be angry, you should be. I could allow myself to believe a lie from the devil, couldn't I? But I had to do this. I'm speaking from personal experience. I had to be honest about myself, to myself. We can talk to a lot of other people about things, and sometimes we share. But who's the hardest person to have an honest conversation with sometimes? Yourself. It's hard to look in that mirror sometimes. I had a little fella the other day. He's sweet as he can be, and I have a little soft spot for him. He's a special situation. And sometimes he has to, because of his situation, maybe be treated a little more elementary because of where he is developmentally and emotionally. So he was kind of struggling with the situation, understanding what he did really was not wisdom. So I was helping him, and he said, "Can I go to the bathroom?" I said, "Yes, you can, sweetie. And I'm glad you want to go, because when you're in there, I want you to look in the mirror, because that's the person you need to be aggravated with right now." Okay. He's the one who created it. So sometimes it's hard to look in the mirror and say, it's your fault, isn't it? And that's a hard conversation. It's hard to look in the mirror and say, yeah, some of your choices led to this, buddy. What are you going to do about it? But how I handle that situation can also be a way of proving the sincerity of what I say I want to believe and how I want to live. I have to be honest with myself first. I had to recognize that what I was tempted, now I'm telling from personal experience, what I was tempted to feel did not seem healthy to me spiritually. So later that night at home, I had battled this situation. I was trying to, in my mind largely, I just have someone I could share it with openly. So I decided, I watched part of a minister's message online. I didn't watch the whole thing. I just watched part. All of a sudden, I could feel the attitude I so desperately wanted to feel, and I wanted to nurse that attitude. I'm being honest, in my flesh, I wanted to nurse it. It kind of felt good, but I knew it wasn't right. Something about it didn't feel healthy for me. And as I watched that lesson or that message, I suddenly realized it was slipping away, Brother Mark, that attitude. It slipped away, and a thought hit me. I got chills because this really hit me. The emotions and feeling I was battling at that time, I would not have been easily entreated if I needed to be. And that's not good. That was not where I needed to be. I would not have been easily entreated. I had to be honest with myself, and I'm just sharing it now. I'm not giving you details because it's not necessary. And as I listened to that message, which had nothing to do with what I was battling, no joke, nothing to do with what I was battling. After I listened to Sister Debbie, it's like I felt cleansed. I needed to let that wash away from me because it was really giving me a struggle. I could have taken the perception it was okay to feel that way too. Often I have watched as an observer, and no judgment for sure because I don't live that life. I have watched as an observer when someone they love has made a bad choice and someone they care about. And the temptation sometimes is, the perception is, I must step in and fix it. I've watched this through my life, largely because of my career. I must step in and fix this. When really, I have found the most successful situations have come when the loving adult has stepped aside and said, they caused this, let them suffer the consequence. There is no fixing. They need to own this, and they don't like how they feel. It hurts when someone you love doesn't feel good, but to rush in and make it all better, as an observer, kids pick up on that fast. Oh, it don't matter what I do. They don't care if you call their parent. Honey, they'll just about call the parent first. Yeah, you might be getting a call from Mr. So-and-so because they can rile that person up. They're ready, knowing they'll be defended. And that is very, very sad. That is not a healthy, how is that an easily entreated spirit? It's not. I had to own that for myself as an individual because I could have tried to take the perception, well, what I feel is okay. Surely this is fine because I feel it. It wasn't. You know what? I didn't even listen to the whole message that I started. I started partway through because honestly, I just realized I feel better. I'm just saying the Lord helped me. In James 3, 14 through 18. Rhonda Ray, do you care to get me some water, honey? In James 3, 14 through 18. But if ye have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, and that is kind of what the devil, I think, wanted me to battle. Thank you, sweetie. Wanted me to battle just some ridiculous. Y'all, I told Rhonda Ray, I'm like, it doesn't even make sense. Why would this make me feel upset? This is stupid. But it was very real, and he wanted me to battle it. But if you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not, and lie not against the truth. God perceives whether or not I have that, right? He's perceiving how I really am. And whether or not I want victory over it or I want to nurse it and self-justify that I'm okay to feel that way. This wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion. Now, why would the devil love for me to have nursed that frustration and anger and, quite frankly, bad attitude? Where there is envying and strife, what else? What enters after that? Confusion and every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable. God brought me peace. It cleansed. It was like it just washed. It's like it just faded away. And I needed it to. Gentle and easy to be entreated. I was not in a state where I felt like I could have been had I needed to be dealt with. Full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy, and the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. My situation that night could have been viewed from two different perspectives. Think about that picture. You could view it from different perspectives, couldn't you? What pops out at you is just what you saw first. It would have been easier in some respects for me to nurture my aggravation and anger that I was feeling, because it was very real to me, trust me. It would have been easy to let that anger and aggravation turn into more anger and greater frustration. But when I had the thought hit me, you would not be easily entreated with this attitude, it humbled me. I needed that. That humbled me. And I thought, Lord, you're right. I would not be easily dealt with right now. I needed to watch my attitude. And again, I could have tried to justify everything I was feeling, the attitude I wanted to have. That would have been one perspective I could have taken facing that moment, right? But I needed the Lord to help me. I needed to know how he was viewing my situation. What was his perception of what I was dealing with? And I'm thankful to say God was faithful. But I first had to be honest with myself. And I'm not sharing that. It ain't lifting me up, please. There've been plenty of times where I've probably gotten it wrong. And I didn't necessarily mean to. And I didn't even intend to be wrong. But I let my perception be skewed by feelings or emotions. And those are things that can be useful and wonderful. But in some situations, if they take control, it can be a problem. There have probably been times when I gave in to my flesh and simply self-justified what I was feeling. And I may not have intended to, but maybe that's what I did. But God expects me to learn from those situations. He expects me to grow and to mature. And I want to be fully aware of how God sees me and views my efforts to say that I want to serve him. If something about my attitude needs to be changed, then I want the Lord to help me. And I want the Lord to show me. Like that image. There are two different images people can see. Both can be justified. Both are correct. However, when serving the Lord, guess who's not always right? Danny. Sometimes I'm not right. I may want to self-justify my perception of myself, but the Lord may view me differently. I have to have God's help. It's easy to take the viewpoint of some of the ideas that I've shared. It's easy to take those and say, oh yeah, people who are lost and they're convincing themselves of all these things that are untrue. But I don't mean it. I don't think it applies there exclusively. It doesn't just exclusively apply to people. It applies to them maybe even differently and maybe in some ways even scarier. But it's true that people live in a perception that doesn't match the reality that God sees in their lives. If someone's lost and they won't admit it, then that's scary. That's a sad perception to let drive your life. It's scary. But you know what? It's just as bad as a Christian for me to say, well, my perception of how I'm acting and how I'm perceived, I could be just like that comedian. Well, I'm loving. And ain't nobody find me loving. I mean, really, is that going to be good for me? No, I need to know the reality from the Lord. An individual may be living all the truth that they understand or he understands, living in such a way that he feels no one can lay a finger on his life or her life. And there's an element of truth to how this person feels. But think of my example for me the other night. Was it sin for me to battle anger? No, anger is an emotion. Be angry and sin not. It was not a sin to feel frustration. It wasn't wrong to not fully understand a situation. So I could have chosen to self-justify how I was feeling that evening as acceptable, couldn't I? I mean, wouldn't that be possible that my mind could take that route? Well, this is okay. You're not doing anything wrong necessarily in how you're feeling. But the fruits of how I was feeling were not proving to be good. Honey, you can be full on right, but the fruit of how you demonstrate it may not do anything good. And what was the point? What would be the point of me nursing those attitudes when I knew the fruit of how I was feeling was not proving to be good? I was not going to be easily entreated if I continued like that. I had to adjust my attitude. God was faithful and he showed me this. But you know what? What if I'd spent all the time I used watching that message online defending how I was feeling? Would I have gotten anything from the message? And to be honest, I don't fully necessarily remember what it was all about, because I think my brain needed a timeout from what I was thinking. And God put on my heart to watch that. And I felt it go away. My focus was no longer on my frustration. What if I'd spent that time, though, brooding over my frustration, brooding over my anger and how I was feeling? You know what? Before long, I could have really let a hateful spirit get a hold of me, couldn't I? That would have been easy. I could have let a real hateful spirit. And that hateful spirit would quite possibly not have only had an impact on me. Who else could have had their evening ruined too? Rhonda Ray. And that's not fair to her. Just because I was not willing to see myself the way God was viewing me, I needed to adjust my perception. And that's kind of my goal this morning. How am I perceiving myself the way God perceives me? And again, people can be self-justified and correct, and they haven't done any sin, but what are the fruits of it? You can approach somebody, and we all know this intellectually, you can approach somebody, and what you say in harshness might be correct, but what are the fruits of the harshness? Nothing productive. Okay? In all cases, it may not be. Sometimes feelings are very important, and they're not necessarily wrong, because sometimes they help us make better decisions. People who seem very apathetic and unfeeling, are they very pleasant people to be around? No. They feel very cold, very distant, complete lack of understanding to everybody in every situation, unless it hits them. Now, when it hits them, it's a different story, isn't it? Then they can relate. Feelings have a place. But the minute I let feelings rule me in an unhealthy way, and I'm not willing to admit it, then I could run into some very serious spiritual trouble. And that's what I didn't want. And that's how the Lord helped me that night. He lined up his perception of what I was feeling with how I was coming across to him. And I needed to see myself the way God saw me. And I'm coming back to this verse that I said I would in 1 John 4:1, but I'm only reading a part of it. Beloved, believe not every spirit. Now, again, when you talk about topics like this, it's very easy to think of someone who's lost and they're deceiving themselves, and that's not good. But you know, as a believer, I should not believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God. Not every spirit about myself may be right. Does that make sense? Not every attitude or thing, emotion or feeling that may want to take hold of me and my actions and rule my decisions and rule my reactions, they may not be right either. Emotions, attitudes, and feelings. I may need to try those spirits, so to speak, and see if they seem to be from the Lord. That night, the thing that helped me, the phrase come to my brain, Danny, you would not be easily entreated right now. That's not word for word exactly how it happened, but just the gist. And that humbled me. I thought, oh man, I really wouldn't be if I nurtured this. I want to be honest before God, because he already knows whether or not what I'm feeling or battling is really justified and necessary. It is amazing what people can get mad about, isn't it? It is amazing what people will let drive a wedge between them and someone else. I don't want to entertain a spirit about myself that the Lord would rather I be rebuking instead. And I'm thankful that he has such traits, that he's understanding of our intentions and he's fair and he's patient. But I have a duty to monitor myself. So I'll put this on me first. There are well-meaning Christians in the world who, if not careful, are their own worst enemies, aren't they? The devil can work in their mind to spread such confusion and doubt over they're in just absolute turmoil. They are never satisfied. They're never happy. I remember a situation from years ago. I haven't seen the person in some time. To me, they were a tormented soul. And it was pitiful. It was just a constant turmoil, it seemed, of things that bothered them and things that they were worried about, and this and that and this and that and this and that. And if not careful, that can become a person who's unapproachable because you're afraid. You don't know what to say. You don't know what to do. I don't want to be a person like that. Some, unfortunately, may be too harsh and they're unapproachable. There are people, and I get kind of tickled, and not every person who says this phrase, do not take this wrong. Some of us may have used this phrase and we didn't mean anything by it. I'm just saying. You kind of know people. They're a well-meaning Christian, and maybe you get the feeling they're a little nosy. They like to know stuff. And under the guise of saying, well, if I better know and understand, I can better pray. Honey, you're praying to a God who already knows. Excuse me. And I understand there's some validity to that in some situations, especially if somebody's offering someone counsel and help. But there's some things that they ain't none of my business. And I don't need to take on the guise that knowing would make it easier. In some situations, it might for people involved. For me, in a marriage, if you're talking to your pastor and getting counsel about a situation, then obviously there's a different level of understanding that may need to be there. But unless individuals are willing to perceive themselves with an honest heart, they really may never be able to help someone else, mightn't they? And I don't want to fall into that category, not because I want people looking at me. That's not even, please, I ain't nothing to look at, literally and figuratively. I fall under both categories for that. But so someone can feel like I have a real experience with the Lord, that I do have that perception. It can be easy to self-justify our behaviors, also based upon our self-impressions and our self-perceptions. And one just has to be careful. Lost people who self-justify their lives, I'm almost done, and tell themselves that everything's okay, they are living a very dangerous life. And we know that. We recognize it. We understand it. Trying to help such individuals is not always about trying to scare them, is it? Because here's what I've learned as a person. If you can scare someone into something, the devil can tickle them right out of it. He can plant another thought and another experience and another way before them. And if that was the only thing driving them. Now, God knows what can work for different people. And the threats of certain things and certain realities certainly can be a motivator for some, and it matters. And once we have an understanding, we don't want any part of those things to be in our life. But living a sincere, honest experience before someone else where they can see us willing to admit our faults, willing to own our choices, willing to share our struggles, willing to share how God has helped us, that can help us be an example before other people that they need, can it? They see that there is honesty and sincerity in what we try to live. If they see us living a life that seems sincere, with a sincere self-perception, then just maybe, they can recognize, and this touches my heart, because this is just what I wish people would see. There's something wonderful about the experience you have with God. There's just something wonderful. If I shared my own personal testimony about different parts of my life, the greatest trial I ever endured, I didn't ask for it, I didn't want it, but it happened. It doesn't matter, it happened. After that great struggle that was very stressful, others of you have had your own that maybe were far worse than mine. I'm not saying mine was up there, but it was a lot to contend with mentally and emotionally. But I cannot ever get away from this. And if people could see this, God brought me the greatest love I could experience after my harshest trial. That is love. That was the reality. That is what I hope people could perceive. I'm not interested in making everyone be like me. Boy, aren't you say amen to that? You go ahead. I don't want them to either. I don't want to make everybody feel like I do about everything I encounter. I'm not interested in bending people to Danny's will. I mean, because we all have different perceptions of things in life, and that's okay. I'm not talking about certain truths or whatever. I'm talking about in life. We all have different experiences. But I am interested in showing people that the Lord offers a wonderful love, a wonderful life. The other night, Danny needed to be humbled. And I was struggling with something, mostly very privately, and then open to my wife about it. And she was very kind. And I got to share with you later, didn't I, Rhonda Ray, how the Lord helped me. Because that thought stuck with me. And I don't remember exact words that came to my mind. But I had to recognize if I was nurturing that attitude, I might want to give myself the perception that it was okay to feel that way, but I was not going to be easily entreated. I didn't have the right spirit about me. I'm interested in showing people that the Lord offers a wonderful life. I'm interested in holding myself in the same perspective that God sees me. I want his help to view that. If I need to adjust anything, like I did the other night, about my attitude or my perception of myself, no matter how holy I may be feeling at that moment, or how I'm living, or how highly I think of what I'm feeling, I want to make the adjustments for God, because that's where he can help me and use me. I really just want others to see that it is wonderful to say that you can serve the Lord. So God help me. I pray I perceive my reality the same way he sees it. And he'll help me keep those things in line. Brother Mark?
Man, very good lesson this morning. I appreciate what the Lord brought to my mind through that. That's really good. I tell you, old self is a tough one. But we need to, if we'll search ourselves and let God use us for his purposes, it'll be a whole lot better than trying to do things on our own. That's really good. I appreciate it. We'll take a little bit of a break and we'll move on to service shortly, Lord willing.